The night Kieran Mallory almost got thrown out of Pinecrest Diner was the same night everything in his life quietly shifted direction, though he wouldn't understand that until much later. He was tired. That was the honest truth. Tired in the way that single fathers get tired. Not just from the hours, but from the specific, grinding weight of being the only person standing between your kid and the world. His daughter Sadie was 7, down with a bad chest cold, and he'd spent the better part of the afternoon calling around for a walk-in clinic appointment while simultaneously trying to fix the furnace, which had decided that mid-February in Peterborough, Ontario was the perfect moment to stop working. By 6 in the evening, Sadie was tucked in and sleeping with a humidifier going, his neighbor Mrs. Okafor sitting with her, and Kieran had driven himself out to pick up soup and a few groceries because the alternative was staring at the walls of his duplex and listening to the furnace make that sound again. He hadn't planned to sit down at Pinecrest, he just hadn't planned to go home yet either. The diner was one of those places that had been there long enough to stop trying to be anything other than what it was. Vinyl booths worn soft at the edges, laminated menus with photographs of the food, a pie display case by the front that was always half empty by dinner time. It smelled like coffee and fryer oil, and something warm underneath that Kieran couldn't name but found deeply, unreasonably comforting. He took a booth near the window and picked up the menu out of habit even though he already knew he was getting the chicken soup and a coffee. That was when he noticed the woman at the counter. She was somewhere in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, wearing the black apron that the Pinecrest staff wore, moving between the coffee station and the register with the kind of quiet efficiency that people develop when they're good at a physical job. She wasn't the only server on. There was a teenager named Kyle working the back section, but she was handling the counter and the front booths alone, and doing it without any visible strain. What Kieran noticed wasn't her, not right away. What he noticed was the man in the second booth from the front. He was the kind of person who made rooms feel smaller. Late 50s, broad shoulders running to fat, a sport coat that had probably fit him better a decade ago, and the particular manner of a man who had been told yes so consistently throughout his life that he'd come to experience any other answer as a personal affront. He had a phone in one hand and hadn't looked up from it since Kieran came in. The woman, her name tag said Tara, Kieran could see it from where he sat, had just set a plate in front of him. He didn't look at the plate. He didn't look at her. "This isn't what I ordered." Tara's expression didn't change. "You ordered the club on brown. That's the club on brown." I said no tomato. There was a pause, the kind of pause that said something had already happened between them before this moment. "I can take the tomato off for you." "I don't want you to take it off. I want it made again, without the tomato, which is what I asked for." Kieran watched her pick up the plate without a word and start back toward the kitchen. The man's voice followed her. "Honestly, is it this hard? Is it this hard to get a simple order right?" He was saying it to no one in particular, to the room, to his phone, to the general concept of the universe not meeting his standards. No wonder this place is half empty. Pinecrest wasn't half empty. It was a Wednesday evening and most of the booths were full. Nobody said anything. That particular silence that crowds produce when something uncomfortable is happening. Not quite complicity, not quite courage, just the human instinct to stay out of it. Tara came back 7 minutes later with a new plate. She set it down. The man looked at it this time. "This bread is different. We were out of the brown. That's our white sourdough. So you're telling me you couldn't manage to tell me that when I ordered? I'm sitting here. You had 7 minutes. I can get you something else from the menu if you'd prefer." "What I'd prefer," he said, his voice dropping into something that was somehow worse than shouting, "is for the staff here to have a basic level of competence. I don't think that's asking a lot." He finally looked up from his phone and his eyes moved over her in a way that had nothing to do with the sandwich. "Some people just aren't suited for customer-facing work. That's just a fact." Tara stood very still. Kieran set down his menu. He didn't make a decision, exactly. There wasn't a moment of deliberation or a plan. Sadie would have called it his dad voice later, when he told her a version of this story, the version where nothing else happened and it was just about standing up for someone being treated badly. He got up from his booth and walked over. "Hey." He kept his voice even. "That's enough." The man turned. He looked at Kieran the way certain people look at obstacles, not with anger yet, just assessment. "Sorry? You heard me." Kieran gestured at Tara. "She brought you what you ordered. You changed the story. She fixed it. Now you're being cruel to her and I need you to stop." The man's assessment shifted. Something in him decided Kieran was not a serious problem. "And you are?" "Nobody," Kieran said. "Just a guy who doesn't want to eat his soup next to this." That got a laugh, a short, dismissive sound. "Right. Okay, hero. Go sit down. I'll sit down when you've apologized." The man's face changed. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that meant the calculation had shifted. You've got some nerve. You don't know who you're talking to. Kieran shrugged. I genuinely don't, and I don't need to. Apologize to her. Tara had taken one quiet step back from the booth. She was watching this with an expression Kieran couldn't fully read. Not frightened, not grateful yet, something more careful than either of those things. There was a quality to the way she held herself, still and contained, like a person who was used to being the most composed person in a room. Kyle had appeared from the back section, hovering uncertainly near the coffee station. The couple in the corner booth had both turned to watch. The man stood up. He was taller than Kieran by 2 inches, and he used those 2 inches consciously, leaning into the space between them. I'm going to suggest very strongly that you go back to your table. After the apology. I don't know what kind of a day you've had. Rough one, actually. Doesn't matter. Apologize. Something happened in the room then. The man turned slightly, maybe to look at Tara, maybe to recalibrate, and when he did, his elbow caught the edge of the sandwich plate and sent it off the table. The clatter was enormous in the relative quiet of the diner. White bread and turkey and a smear of mustard across the black and white tile. Everyone went still, and Tara very quietly said, I'll clean that up, don't! Kieran looked at her when he said it. Not a command, more like a question he already knew the answer to. She looked back at him, and something passed between them that was hard to put into words. A moment of mutual recognition. 2 people seeing each other clearly in the middle of something absurd. You know what, the man said, reaching into his jacket for his wallet. This place isn't worth my time. He dropped 2 20s on the table. More than the bill, which might have been deliberate or might have been carelessness. It was impossible to tell, and picked up his coat. People like you, he said, looking at Kieran, think you're doing something noble. You're not. You're just making a scene. He walked out. The door swung shut. The room breathed again. Someone in the back booth quietly started talking to his companion about something else. Kyle disappeared into the kitchen. The couple in the corner looked at each other, and one of them shook their head with a small, private smile. Tara bent down and started picking up the pieces of the sandwich from the floor. Kieran bent down too. You don't have to, she said. I know. He picked up the plate. I knocked it over, basically. Indirectly, he knocked it over. I provoked him. She looked at him sideways. There was something in her expression that was close to amusement but hadn't fully committed to it yet. That's a very specific way to feel responsible for something that wasn't your fault. I have a daughter, Kieran said. It's a professional hazard, she laughed. It was small and genuine and surprised him a little, the way real laughter surprises you when it comes from somewhere honest. She stood back up with the broken plate pieces, and he stood back up with nothing useful in his hands, and they were briefly very close in the narrow space beside the booth. Tara, he said, because that was her name, and he didn't know what else to say. Yeah, she stepped back toward the counter. You should go finish your order, before it gets cold. I haven't ordered yet. Right, that same edge of not quite amusement. Go sit down and I'll come by. He went and sat down. She brought him coffee first, which she poured without being asked, and then she came back 5 minutes later with a notepad. She took his order, chicken soup, a side of bread, a piece of apple pie because she mentioned it, and he found he didn't want to say no. And she brought everything in the right order at the right temperature without any visible effort, which was the mark of someone who actually knew what they were doing. He ate slowly. He didn't have anywhere to be. Mrs. Okafor had told him to take his time, and he'd taken her at her word for once. He watched Tara work. She had a way of moving through a space that was efficient without being hurried, and she spoke to the other tables in short, warm sentences that seemed calibrated to exactly what each person needed. The elderly man at the counter got a little extra conversation. The family with the toddler got cheerful patience when the kid knocked over a juice cup. She didn't perform any of it. It just seemed to be her natural frequency. At some point, Kyle came over and refilled his water and said, "That was pretty solid, man. That guy's been in here before. He's always like that. Does he come often?" "Few times a month. Usually sits in someone else's section." Kyle glanced over his shoulder. Tara always ends up with him somehow. She never lets anyone see it bother her, though. Kieran didn't say anything to that. Around 8 o'clock, the dinner rush had fully settled into a slower hum, and Tara came by with the coffee pot again and didn't immediately leave after she filled his cup. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure, why did you do that?" Really. She wasn't accusing him of anything. The question was genuinely curious. Most people don't. Kieran thought about it honestly instead of reaching for the easy answer. "My daughter has been sick all week. I've been running on 4 hours of sleep and cold leftovers, and I came in here tonight just to sit somewhere warm for 20 minutes. And then that started, and I guess just I didn't want to be someone who sat there and did nothing. He paused. That probably sounds self-serving. A little, she said, and there was warmth in it, but it also sounds true. What about you? How do you do it? That kind of thing. He gestured vaguely at where the booth had been. Not react. She was quiet for a moment. I've had a lot of practice being in rooms where I had to be the most patient person. He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't, right then. She tucked the coffee pot under her arm and said, "Your daughter's sick? Chest cold. She'll be fine. She's tougher than me." "How old?" "7." Tara nodded. Slow. "What's her name?" "Sadie." Something crossed her face. "Brief and private. That's a good name. She chose it herself, basically. She couldn't say her original name when she started talking, so she called herself Sadie, and it stuck. He said this the way parents say things about their kids when they're tired, unself-conscious, unguarded. Her actual name is Sandra, after her grandmother. She'll probably go back to it when she's older, or she'll be Sadie her whole life, and Sandra will be the name on official documents that no one calls her. "Probably that," Kieran said. She smiled. Really smiled this time, not the near smile from before. It changed her face. Not dramatically, just the way a room changes when someone turns on a lamp that was already there. She left to check on her other tables. He finished the pie, which was excellent, and sat a little longer than he needed to, telling himself it was because it was cold outside. He left a 20 on top of a $12 bill, and then thought about it, and put another 10 under the sugar dispenser, which felt either generous or weird, and he couldn't decide which. He was putting on his coat when Kyle called over, "Hey, Tara says to tell you she hopes your daughter feels better." Kieran looked toward the kitchen, where Tara had just disappeared through the swinging door. "Thanks," he said to nobody in particular. He drove home through February streets that were quiet and gray-white with old snow. And he thought about Sadie sleeping in her room with the humidifier going, and he thought about the way Tara had said, "I've had a lot of practice being in rooms where I had to be the most patient person," and he couldn't quite fit that sentence into the shape of someone who worked a dinner shift at Pinecrest Diner. He filed it away. He didn't know what else to do with it. The week after was ordinary in all the ways Kieran's life was ordinary. Sadie recovered, went back to school, came home with a painting of our house that featured him as a figure twice the size of the building, which she explained was because he was tall. The furnace got fixed expensively. He had a project deadline at the architecture firm where he worked as a senior draftsman, and he spent 2 evenings hunched over drawings with a cold coffee. He didn't go back to Pinecrest. Then on the following Friday he did, because it was the closest place to the hardware store, and he'd already eaten a granola bar for lunch, and it was 3 in the afternoon and he was tired. Tara was there. She was in a different section today, covering the back half of the room, but she looked up when he came in and there was a beat of recognition, small and mutual, before she went back to what she was doing. He sat in her section. He tried to make it look accidental and suspected he'd failed. She came over without the notepad. "Soup again?" "Coffee, actually, and maybe the soup. How's the soup today?" "Same as always. Chef's been making it the same way since 2009. She tilted her head. "There's also a lentil thing on the board that's good if you want something different. What would you get?" "The lentil thing," she said immediately. "Then that." She brought the coffee first. Then the soup. It was a red lentil with cumin and greens, and it was much better than he'd expected, thick and warm and actually seasoned. He told her so when she came by. "Right? It doesn't look like much. It tastes like someone made it on purpose." She laughed at that. "I'll tell the chef you said so. He'll be extremely pleased with himself for 3 days." They talked more this time in the intervals between her other tables. She'd grown up in Calgary, moved to Peterborough for reasons she summarized as complicated and now resolved. She'd been at Pinecrest for about a year. She liked it, she said, which she delivered matter-of-factly, without the note of mild embarrassment that people sometimes offered when describing service work, as though being a skilled server were something that required apology. There was none of that in her. He told her about the architecture firm, about how he'd started in residential and migrated into municipal work, and had opinions about Ontario public libraries that could fill an hour if anyone gave him the opening, which she seemed to file away as information without necessarily inviting the full lecture. "You have an hour's worth of opinions about libraries," she said. "At least an hour. What's the 1-minute version?" He gave her the 1-minute version. She listened without checking her phone or her tables, which he noticed, and when he finished, she said, "That's actually interesting. I thought you were going to say something boring. What did you think I was going to say?" "I thought you were going to say that libraries should have better parking." "That's a completely separate issue," Kieran said. "Also, yes." She was called away to handle a table near the front. He finished the soup and the coffee and got a refill on the coffee and tried to remember the last time he'd had a real conversation with a person who wasn't a colleague or a parent from Sadie's school or Mrs. Okafor, who was excellent company but spoke primarily about her garden and her church choir, subjects Kieran found easier to receive than to contribute to. When he got up to pay, Tara was at the counter. She took his card and then said, without particular emphasis, "You should bring Sadie in sometime, when she's feeling better. The pie here is, well, you know the pie I do. Kids usually go for the cherry." Kieran took his card back. "I'll keep that in mind." He drove home and looked up the Pinecrest Diner on his phone before he'd even taken off his coat for no reason he could fully justify. He brought Sadie on a Saturday in early March. She was fully recovered and had reached the post-illness energy spike that 7-year-olds achieve, which means she was approximately 3 times louder than usual and had already asked him 14 questions before they got through the diner door. She stopped when she saw the pie display case. "Dad." Her voice was reverent. "That's a lot of pie." "It is. Can I have 2 pieces?" "You can have 1 piece." "What if I? 1 piece, Sadie." Tara spotted them from the middle of the room and raised a hand in greeting. Sadie, who had no sense of the situation and was therefore the freest person in it, waved back enthusiastically at a total stranger. They got seated. Tara came over. "This must be Sadie," she said. Sadie looked up from the menu with the unflinching assessment that small children apply to unfamiliar adults. "How do you know my name?" "Your dad mentioned you." Sadie considered this, decided it was acceptable, and said, "Do you work here all the time?" "Most days." "Do you get free pie?" Sadie Kieran started. "That's actually a great question," Tara said, sitting down on the edge of the bench across from them, which Kieran wouldn't have expected her to do. "And the answer is, sometimes if there's a slice left at the end of a shift and I've had a good day. What if you have a bad day? Then I probably still take the pie. I just feel less like I earned it." Sadie thought this was hilarious. She laughed the full-body laugh that kids do before they learn to be self-conscious about it, and Kieran watched Tara's face when it happened. Just for a second, unguarded, and saw something that looked like genuine delight, the kind that didn't perform itself. They ordered. Sadie got the grilled cheese and, after significant negotiation, the cherry pie. Kieran got the lentil soup again because it was still cold outside and because he'd been thinking about it all week in a way that had nothing to do with the lentils. Tara checked in on them a few times without hovering. At one point, Sadie asked her what her favorite color was. This was Sadie's primary method of assessing new people, and Tara said forest green without hesitating, which Sadie approved of because she said it was a specific answer and not a boring one like blue. On the drive home, Sadie was quiet for about 2 minutes, which was notable. "Dad, I like that lady." Kieran kept his eyes on the road. "Good. She talked to me like I was a regular person." "You are a regular person. Some adults talk to kids like we're babies. She didn't do that." I noticed, more quiet. "Then is she your friend?" Kieran thought about the honest answer. "I think we're getting there." Sadie seemed satisfied with this. She looked out the window at the graying March landscape and said, "Her favorite color is the same as the forest in my book." "Which book?" "The one with the fox." He nodded. He knew the one. March turned the way March in Ontario eventually does, reluctant and gray and then suddenly not. Kieran found himself at Pinecrest every week or so, which was more often than he could justify purely on the basis of the lentil soup. He and Tara had developed a shorthand. They talked in the gaps of her shifts in the language of people who have limited time and use it carefully. She knew about Sadie's school project on Canadian wetlands, about the furnace that had been repaired and then made the sound again. He knew she was a runner, that she'd once done a half-marathon in Vancouver in the rain and finished it despite everything, that she read history. Old, dense, footnoted history, the kind with maps, in the evenings. What he didn't know was why she was working at Pinecrest. Not that he needed to. People had their reasons. He'd learned not to ask questions that had the shape of, "So what are you doing here, really?" Because that question was a judgment wearing a curiosity costume. He'd been on the receiving end of it enough himself. So is this temporary, the single dad thing while you sort things out, to know to leave it alone. What he did notice, the way her attention moved when her phone buzzed, the careful total absence of personal details from her life before Calgary, the way she sometimes used language that didn't quite fit the context, not wrong, just precise in a way that sounded like habit from somewhere else, some other kind of room. The man came back on a Thursday. Kieran wasn't there when it started. He'd dropped in for a coffee at 5:30, taken the corner booth, and was half reading something on his phone when he heard a voice from the front of the diner that he recognized before he consciously placed it. The man in the sport coat. He was at the counter this time, and he'd apparently come in with a companion, A younger man in a pressed shirt who was doing the thing where you try to look uninvolved while also visibly accompanying someone. The man had a coffee in front of him and was in the middle of something. Tara's was behind the counter. Same problem every single time. It's just not difficult. His voice was carrying the same tone from before, the particular pitch of a man who believed volume was a substitute for argument. I've been patient. I've given this place multiple chances. This is the last one. I understand you're frustrated, Tara said. Do you? Because I keep coming in here, I keep trying to be a reasonable person, and every time it's the same experience. And I'm beginning to think it's not the menu, it's just the people. What can I get for you? I want to know what you're going to do to make this right. Make what right, specifically. Her voice was perfectly level. He made a gesture that meant everything and nothing. The whole experience. Every time, if there's a specific item or service that hasn't met your expectations, I'm happy to help with that. You know what your problem is? He leaned slightly forward. You don't actually care. You people just don't care. You people. Kieran heard it from across the room. He was already standing. You need to leave, he said, from where he was before he'd fully thought it through. The man turned, saw Kieran, and something flickered through his expression. Recognition, then calculation, then a kind of irritated certainty. You again. Me again, Kieran said, crossing the room. You were here a few weeks ago. You said the same things then. You were asked to leave. I don't know why you came back. This is a public establishment. It's a private business. And you've been spoken to before. He looked at Tara. Have the owners been told about this? She met his eyes. And again, that quality. The stillness that wasn't fear. It's handled, she said very quietly. Is it? The man said. I don't think it's your business what this establishment does or doesn't. Then leave, Kieran said. He wasn't angry, which surprised him. He was just clear. If it's not my business, leave. And if you feel strongly that you're in the right here, take it up with the owner. The younger man in the pressed shirt touched the sport coat's arm very briefly with the look of someone who'd been in this situation before and knew how it ended. The man looked at Kieran, at Tara, back at Kieran. This city, he said to no one, and picked up his coat and left. The younger man followed with an expression that looked almost like relief. The diner settled. Kieran stood at the counter, adrenaline clearing, feeling slightly foolish and not quite sure why. Tara was looking at him. You keep doing that, she said. He keeps coming back. He does. She was quiet for a moment, then, thank you. You don't have to keep doing that. I know I don't have to. She looked at him carefully, not the way she'd looked at him the first time. That was measured and guarded, and understandably so. This was different. Something had shifted somewhere in the weeks of lentil soup and conversations in the gaps. Sit down, she said. I'll bring you coffee. He sat. She brought coffee. The dinner rush was picking up around them, Kyle weaving between tables in the back, the smell of the kitchen sharpening, the windows steaming slightly against the cold outside. Kieran wrapped both hands around the mug and waited for his heart rate to slow down. Tara leaned against the counter across from him, and for once she wasn't watching her other tables. She was watching him. Can I ask you something? She said. You asked me that before. I know. A pause. Your daughter's name is Sadie. You work at an architecture firm. You have opinions about libraries. Your furnace breaks every winter. You came in here 3 weeks ago because you needed somewhere warm to sit. She tilted her head. What happened to her mother? He didn't expect the directness. Most people circled around it or avoided it entirely. She left, he said, when Sadie was 2. It wasn't her fault, exactly. She was dealing with things she didn't have the language for yet. She's doing better now. She's in Vancouver. Sadie knows her. They talk on the phone. But you're alone. Yeah, he looked down at the coffee. I'm alone. Tara was quiet for a moment. I know something about that. I thought you might. She looked up at him, quick and sharp. Why? He shook his head. The way you move through a room, like you're used to being self-sufficient, like you stopped waiting for backup a long time ago. She considered that for a long time. I should tell you something, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She was repeating his own words back to him, and she knew it, and there was the ghost of a smile in it. Pinecrest is my diner. Kieran looked at her. I own it, she said. I've owned it for 3 years. I bought it when I moved here from Calgary, where things were different. She said the last part without elaboration. I worked the floor because I wanted to understand it. I wanted to know what it actually took. I didn't want to own something I didn't understand. She paused. And then I just kept going because I realized I liked it, the work itself. I liked talking to people who weren't. I liked people who were just eating dinner. Kieran was quiet. The man who came in both times, she said. He knew someone who knew someone. He found out somewhere along the way that the owner was working the floor, and he made a point of coming in and being, she gestured, what he was. Because he thought it would embarrass me, make me react. Did it work? Tonight it would have, she said, and the honest admission of it was startling in its quietness. Tonight I was tired enough that I wasn't sure I could hold it. Kieran looked at her for a moment. That's why I stepped in, he said, though he hadn't known that when he did it. You didn't look frightened, you just looked tired. I was. She folded her hands on the counter. I still am a little. What did you own before? In Calgary, she inhaled slowly. A company, a small one at first, then not as small, technology consulting, supply chain logistics. I sold it 4 years ago, a pause. It was a good sale. I won't give you numbers. I didn't ask for numbers. Most people ask for numbers. I don't particularly care about numbers. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the controlled warmth, not the careful professional courtesy, but something more open than either. Like a window that had been painted shut for years, and someone had quietly worked the frame until it moved. Then what do you care about? She said. Sadie, he said immediately. Libraries, a beat. Whether the lentil soup is going to be on the menu next month. Tara laughed. It was the full laugh this time, unguarded, the real one underneath the one she used at work. It'll be on the menu, she said. I'll make sure of it. April came in muddy and then turned golden almost overnight, the way Ontario springs do when they finally commit. The Pinecrest patio opened up for the season, and Kieran and Sadie sat outside on a Saturday morning in early May with tea and orange juice and a cherry pie that Tara had set aside the night before because she'd had a good day, and there was a slice left and she'd thought of Sadie. Tara sat with them. She'd handed off her section for an hour. Sadie was telling her about the wetlands project, which had been presented to her class and received very well. And she had opinions about the response and was delivering them comprehensively. Tara was listening the way she always listened to Sadie, not indulging her, but following her with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions that showed she'd actually heard the details. Kieran watched them both. He thought about the man in the sport coat and the way he'd looked at Tara, and the way that kind of person looked at the world. Like it was divided into people worth seeing and people not worth the effort. He thought about the specific and curious confidence required to be like that, to move through spaces where other people were working and see nothing of consequence. He thought about sitting in this same diner in February, exhausted and cold, just trying to be somewhere warm for 20 minutes. He thought about what you missed when you didn't see people, and what you found when you did. Sadie had finished her point about the wetlands and had moved on to asking whether Tara had ever seen a real beaver dam, and Tara was saying that actually yes, once on a camping trip outside of Banff, and it was enormous, much larger than she'd expected. The engineering of it almost architectural. She caught Kieran's eye when she said architectural, and there was a spark of deliberate amusement in it, a shared joke being offered. He shook his head, smiling. Sadie looked between them with the sharp, experienced eye of a child who has navigated complex social situations her whole short life. Are you guys friends now? She said. Tara looked at Kieran. Kieran looked at Tara. I think we're getting there, he said. And Tara, who owned the diner and the morning and the particular way the spring light was coming through the window behind her, picked up her tea and said, yeah, I think we are too.